Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a game that I just got done reviewing a little bit ago with the engine Stockfish. It's a game I pulled randomly from one of my friends on chess.com. It was a 30-minute game, and both players were rated roughly 1650. So I'll just go ahead and share some of the insights that I gathered when reviewing for this here, going over it with the computer. Eventually we get a d4 break-in, some fairly natural moves so far. We get that d4 break-in, c takes d, knight takes d, and then bishop c5. This is where there's going to be the first main improvement in the game. Black's decision to play bishop c5. There's certainly going to be an adjustment with that, but before I get into it, something that I had questioned at this moment here is whether to take first on d4 and then play d5, or to play d5 immediately. And I found an interesting tactic. If black plays d5 right now, e takes d, it would seem, since this pawn has not yet committed itself to taking on d4, that bishop to b3 is not a good idea, because the move c4, it's just crying out to be played, with this bishop basically being stuck. If he goes to a4, there's now b5. But what I found surprising is that after c4, you can actually take this pawn. And after the recapture, there's now d5. Knight e7, rook e1. How are you preventing d6 to win the piece back? White is actually the preferred side. Even though they're down a minor piece, they will get the material back. Queen d6 is just a temporary solution to this pawn pushing immediately. Queen d4 would be the follow-up, a nice centralization of the queen with bishop f4. The queen will soon be kicked and d6 will push right through. So that's just a very early, from this early position, an interesting tactic that I came across. My idea of maybe playing d5 first, I was initially thinking, well, after takes, the bishop would have to retreat to one of these, I guess, not as aggressive squares, but he can still stay on this diagonal without fear of c4. Okay, well, in the game it was c takes d, knight takes d, and like I was saying, this bishop c5 move, this is where there can be an adjustment. If I was to summarize this particular game, it would, well, if there's a particular square on the chessboard that really stands out in this whole game, it's the square e5, as we'll see. There are many opportunities for white to push with e5, and, well, white doesn't do that. And there were many opportunities for black to prevent this push, but black didn't do that. This square was ignored by both sides, and there could have been a big shift with the evaluation, at least on the white side, if white is to push with e5. We'll see that coming shortly, but this next move, bishop c5, there's a problem with it. White can follow up with knight takes knight. In the game it was bishop to e3, but if knight takes knight, if you're taking with the d-pawn, even though the queens are off the board, this is a bit uncomfortable for black. You could give the knight a kick right away, you could give a check. After check, I'm not even sure where the king belongs. King e7, now here comes e5. And moves like this, there's not going to be any fear of this double attack because there's a counter punch hitting the bishop, defending the pawn, and then white can address this pawn and maybe even sideline the knight soon thereafter. So if we did get to this point, the knight would have to retreat. We can have bishop here with ideas of knight to e4. White is certainly the side who's much more free, being fully developed. And this bishop is it's hard to imagine how he contributes anytime soon, still having to solve this problem. This was the first instance where there was this e5 push, in other words. You'll notice if takes here, there's still e5, and maybe this is even more difficult for the black side with the queen still on the board, white having a space advantage, and maybe even ideas of making use of the g4 square soon as the knight moves. Okay, well, white didn't go for that. Instead it was bishop e3, knight takes, bishop takes, and then bishop returns. And there's something better here. After bishop to e3, the knight has to, I don't know has to, but this is going to be a better choice. Knight into e5, hitting the bishop, and then maybe following up with the d6. So that's a small improvement right there. After taking and the recapture, this is back on, this e5 advance. And maybe one of the better moves is to play d6 here. But after returning with the bishop, this move right here is without question being crying out to be played. And it wasn't. This was a way to really inconvenience the knight. Instead, it was bishop to e3. I'm not quite sure what the idea was behind this. I could see some idea behind it. There might have been this idea to try and prevent the d5 advance, maybe getting the bishop out of the way to defend d5. But there's something much more direct. Instead of retreating, you can move forward. Whenever you could plant one of your pawns in your opponent's position with tempo, that's something to give strong consideration to. And, well, on top of that, if you can force that very piece in reverse, in this case he would have to underdevelop, this is just way too good for Team White. With this last move, White would be fully developed, and Black is how many moves away from being fully developed, having to develop a knight, castle, queen out, and 2 moves before the queen bishop is out. Big trouble for Black. This was a moment to just play e5, but instead it was bishop e3. Black castles. This is yet another opportunity to play e5. So what would be better here? Queen c7. This is a perfect square for the queen. These 2 prep moves have been played in order to secure this queen's position. She's really nice on this square, watching over e5 and also throwing a punch at the bishop. So this is going to be an improvement. Queen here, maybe even d6 are ideas, something to certainly secure the knight on f6. But again, this square was neglected by both sides, so Black castled, bishop to d3. I guess looking for, well, I'm not sure. Maybe trying to focus on this square, maybe anticipating this b5 advance. b5 is played, still another opportunity for e5, which is good, but instead the reply a3. a3 is securing the knight, but does this knight need to be secure? Like, is there a big fear of this knight being kicked in this position? This is an interesting point in the game, because when it's so open like this, you really, pawn moves, I'm not so sure that you really need to make pawn moves in this position. Like, I see what a3 is doing, but what about just allowing this b4 move, right? What if you can just allow this to be played and then react in a way where your knight will improve his position? I'm once again hinting at this particular advance. Playing e5, the knight would have to go here, and now you grab some space, you open the diagonal, and if b4 ever happens, that is perfectly welcome. I would love to see b4 eventually, because you would be kicking a knight to a square that it wants to go to. If you want to play b4, you're wasting time and just allowing the knight to occupy an even better post. So this is what we can say a strictly defensive move, and, well, I guess we could also file it under the unnecessary category. There's a better, more forceful approach in this position. Again, e5. So a3 was played, bishop b7, and now this move is maybe still okay, but it's basically lost its sting at this point. As soon as the bishop arrives on this long diagonal, e5 is not going to be as effective. e5, he could take up a nice central post. Okay, well, it was queen f3, rook c8. Queen's trying to get over here, clearly. These are some couple good moves in here with the rooks getting on an open file. Ideas of bishop to h6, rook to e8, maybe paving the way for bishop to f8 to defend g7. Bishop h6, knight h5, a counterpunch and defense of g7. Not bad. Queen g4, g6. This seems well, doesn't seem weakening. It is weakening, but I don't know that there's a way that you can really exploit these dark squares. This knight, surprisingly enough, is a pretty good, reliable defender of these dark squares on black's king side. So e5 is played now, paving the way for knight to e4, maybe jumping into f6. And I think one of the last big decision points right here is for black. It's a critical move here, d5, because there's also the option to try and eliminate what is quite possibly the most dangerous pawn in the position, this guy on e5. So if not d5, what more? This is the other one to give strong consideration to. There's two ways you can try to put pressure on e5 at this point, f6 and d6. f6, however, fails to bishop takes g7, pawn takes, queen takes, and this is a tough road ahead for black. But you can challenge it. The other move besides d5, which is fine, is d6, just trying to eliminate this pawn, keep this file open for the queen, and, well, again, just another direction to go in. I don't know that there's a way to really take advantage of this king's position, even though these squares have been weakened. No pawn around, this bishop can take out a piece that arrives on this square. There'll be enough defense. He could be challenged with bishop to f8. And I think long-term advantages will be much more telling in this position, and I believe they favor the black side. Okay, well, it wasn't d6, instead d5. White looks to reposition. Queen e5 hits the pawn on e5. This is f4 defends e5. It also kind of shuts in this bishop. Alright, I'm not sure. He's not going to be returning in this direction, it would seem, anytime soon. He's kind of locked in now. Was there a better way to defend? I'm not so sure. There really wasn't, right? Because these squares are covered by the knight. I'm not so sure you want to either. I'm not so sure you want to defend the pawn with your queen. So I believe f4 is quite reasonable. d4. This was an interesting pawn sacrifice. This is just doing what? Clearing the way for this bishop to be felt in the position. White grabs that pawn and black immediately pins it and then takes it. I don't know that it matters so much in this particular position, but it's certainly not my first choice to take the knight right away. He's not going anywhere, so one idea that springs to mind is to get a rook off of this closed file to this completely open file, just to add more fuel to that pinned piece. This is the first one that comes to mind for me, and it's a good move here. And maybe even ensuing moves of queen to b6. Not yet capturing on this square, but maybe just piling up on it is a better approach. Well, he captured right away. Queen b6. Now f5. This was a nice move, making use of this pin on the g-pawn and allowing the queen to defend d4 laterally. So a nice move with f5. Takes, bishop takes. Now rook d8, hitting at d4 twice now, and it's not so easily defended. This next move, bishop to e3, is tactically flawed. A better approach might have been to play e6 and stir up some trouble against the f7 pawn. If pawn takes here, we're smashing through on g6. And this is probably a way to take advantage of the black position, not going into defensive mode, but looking for something more aggressive in nature, and e6 would certainly be aggressive, looking for this capture with the fork, with some potential discoveries on the f-file. So e6 would have been a little bit better there. After bishop to e3, there's an interesting tactical shot here that black has. If you'd like to, go ahead, pause the video, see what you could come up with for team black. Okay, the move here, well, the move played in the game was knight to g7, throwing a punch at the bishop, but there is this tactical shot of rook takes e5, and if pawn takes, the queen comes in here with check. If king here, rook to d2, well, in fact, on whatever move, it's going to be rook to d2, rook f2, rook d2, and what are you going to do? Rook to f1, there's knight to f4. This is a very interesting line. In fact, after knight to f4, smashing through on g2, keeping this rook in a pin. If queen takes knight, you could take queens, exchange queens, and then we have this windmill tactic, the check. Actually, my mistake. At this point right here, take the bishop, and then this is going to be very difficult to meet. Maybe h4, and now you give a check, you come back over, and you could do this. You're going to be picking up the a-pawn soon, but before you do that, after king g1, bishop to e4, and this is just too good. This pawn will drop very soon, the pawn on a3, and it's going to be 6 pawns versus 2. A bishop that's super glued right in the middle of the board, and this rook is dead. It's very difficult to get him activated. He'll be scooped up, and these pawns are certainly going to be quite telling. So that was a interesting possibility, again, taking on this square and then smashing through here and looking for pressure on g2, something we eventually do see in the game, pressure on g2, but yeah, that was missed. Rook to g, instead of rook takes e5, was knight g7. The bishop backs up, looking to get to this b3 square. White is the better side here, but black does a good job to control this pawn from advancing. It's quite difficult for these guys to get rolling. Black has defense of f7, white has pressure on it. We have a mate threat on g2, white is there to defend, knight e6, some pressure being applied to d4 now, queen d5 gets out of any discoveries. Nice centralizing move, takes, rook d1. He needed some support. More pressure on d4, and it's quite difficult for white to do anything here. White is still the better side, being up a pawn, having the bishop pair, slight space advantage. I'm not sure what the time situation was by this point in the game, but there must be something better than king to h1, working yourself into a pin. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Rook to d2 with ideas of bishop d1 and then f3 could have been an idea. But still, black will maintain light square control in such a position. If you could envision one without light square bishops on the board, it's very difficult to break down this black side. I actually don't know that we could really trust a computer evaluation so much in this type of position. Seems all strung together, very harmonious on the black side at this point, even though white is a pawn up. Okay, well, it was king h1, b4, the rook is hit, rook c1, and now b3 was a very strong move. This is looking to trap the bishop with queen to c4, and maybe even play rook to c2, now that the bishop is cut off from defending c2. I really like this move. I believe it was a top move by the Stockfish engine. After b3, rook to d3, we had rook c2, which is super appealing. It does drop f7, but black, I believe, calculated this, seeing an enormous amount of pressure on g2, but there was actually something a bit simpler. After rook to d3, this rook on d3 is now the second unprotected piece. Queen c4 would just win on the spot. One of these pieces will be won. And then maybe even later you could be doing rook to c2, but as it turned out in this one, it was rook c2, allowing queen takes f7 with check, king h8, queen check, knight g7, and I believe this is what black probably saw, that there's not a good way to defend g2, and black's correct. There's not going to be a good way to defend g2. Best is rook to f3 or queen to f3 to put up some resistance, although black still stands the better side. Rook f3, there could follow rook c1, bishop block, and this is a strong move, queen to a5, hitting the rook and the bishop. But we didn't have that. Instead, it was rook to g1, and this is not going to be a good enough defense. of g2. It's hit 3 times. Black simply smashes right through. Rook takes g2, rook, or not rook recapture, but rather bishop to b3, hitting the queen, but keep in mind rook takes rook is double check. King takes rook and queen g2 simply ends the game. That's mate. So that was a interesting game. The main points with this one right here, again, I found it quite interesting. This tactic of c4 can be met with bishop takes and then a pawn push. And then the big square, the one that's highlighted time and time again in this game, is that e5 square. White should be pushing in many instances, and black should be preventing it with ideas of queen to c7. Again, as it was in this game, after the bishop got on this b7 square, this move lost its sting. We can also do better than a3 by pushing here. b4, knight to e4. And what more? Oh, right here, instead of d5, d6 was another one to be considering. And an interesting pawn sack with d4. Not to take the piece right away. He's not going anywhere. Rook to d8. And f5, that was a strong move. And then instead of this bishop backing up, pawn to e6. Just some of the main points I wanted to go back over right here. But again, this was a very difficult position once it got to this point for white to really show that extra pawn. Again, having firm control over that d5 square, a very nice blockade despite being down a pawn. And then this nice move b3. Queen c4 would have done the trick. But this seems like it's going to be very difficult to defend. Even if white played at this moment here, rook to f3 or queen to f3, still would have been quite difficult. But again, as it happened in this game, after bishop takes b3, it was double check and then mate on g2. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye. It's a bit scary for me to see these weaknesses. If, you know, I should say my eyes would be lighting up if I'm playing on the white side and I'm seeing g6. Immediately be looking to try and exploit these dark squares.